addressing the joint, let's see here, the joint comprehensive plan of action that was an executive agreement negotiated by President Obama with the government of Iran years ago. An executive agreement does not have the status of a treaty and can be unilaterally abrogated by any other president for any reason whatsoever. And as background, the United States currently possesses about 3,750 nuclear warheads, vastly greater in their destructive potential than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. It's also important to note that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty reserves for 5 special nations authority to possess nuclear weapons that no other country in the world enjoys. It was a privilege that was forced by power politics in 1969, and those 5 countries are the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France, but they were not selected because it was thought they were more morally responsible than any other nations. And then lastly, we need to recognize that within the area of Iran, there are nuclear warheads possessed by Israel, Pakistan, India. It's not as though there's a nuclear free zone there. And further, it's clear, I think, from the Iranian perspective that after Colonel Gaddafi abandoned weapons of mass destruction in Libya, it wasn't long before the United States destroyed his country and he was slaughtered, which sends a message rather clearly that when the United States feels that you're vulnerable as a foreign country and they want regime change, if you don't have nuclear weapons, you can expect some kind of effort to overthrow you. That's a lesson I think North Korea has also learned. Those are just background observations about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But let's us begin with Negar, from the Iranian perspective. How do you see the negotiations and the prospects of success?
Sure, thanks, Bruce, and thank you to the National Interest Foundation for inviting me, for hosting this important event, and hello to my fellow panelists, an excellent panel put together here. It's great that you gave that sort of a big, very grand view of things. I usually try to give a grand view, but now let me step a little closer to the issue of the JCPOA. Obviously, as the audience knows, the JCPOA was an agreement that was reached in 2015 after a few years of very, very intense negotiations between Iran and world powers, as known the P5+1, which the United States was one party of that multilateral negotiation. And then the deal had about 1 year to sort of materialize after its implementation. And then President Trump came into office. He had threatened to pull out of the deal, and eventually he did that in 2018. So talking about where we are now, I just want to keep that in mind, that the United States is outside of the JCPOA right now. It has been for over 3 years now, since May of 2018, I believe. And over 2 years of that time was under the Trump administration, who decided to pull out of the deal, and about a year of that has fallen now under President Biden. With the election of Joe Biden in November, there was renewed hope, I think, in Tehran. Obviously, we're watching US elections very closely, and among some Iran watchers like myself, that the United States would rejoin the JCPOA. It was an election promise of President Biden. Part of his team were actually the ones who negotiated the deal under President Obama, the Obama-Biden administration back then. And President Biden himself, back then candidate Biden, and senior members of his administration warned President Trump and criticized him for pulling out of the JCPOA. So there was an expectation that a return to the JCPOA by the United States would happen as a priority, as a foreign policy priority of the Biden administration early on in the beginning of this government. And it's so far been since January, about nearly a year now, that the US hasn't returned to the JCPOA. There have been some constructive discussions on basically agreeing on a sequence to return to the JCPOA, because Iran also, in this time, Iran hasn't technically left the deal. They have still stayed the deal, but they have reduced their compliance. They have expanded their nuclear program. And my understanding is that Tehran's calculation is that this is their own way of gaining leverage in the negotiations and sort of putting pressure by this escalation, putting pressure on the other side, meaning the United States, to return back to the JCPOA. So there have been, there were 6 rounds of talks under the previous administration of Iran, the Rouhani administration, the moderates, with the Biden administration. It seemed like reporting and sources had confirmed that they were almost getting to that point of agreeing on a sequence, but it was just too close to the Iranian presidential election also, which happened in June. There was a change of administration. The moderates are out. The hardliners have consolidated power now in Iran. And so this latest round of nuclear negotiations was the 7th round. It was the first with the hardline team in Iran. It's a new team. They have very hawkish views very hardline views towards the United States. Some of them are very vocal against the JCPOA, the way the previous administration negotiated the deal. And even the silver lining, I would say, with this new team is that I see them as hardliners 2.0. So they're not exactly the same cut as the previous hardline administration, which would be President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in Iran. And back then, there wasn't a JCPOA existing. This time, this hardline team seems to not wanting to start from scratch and sort of redoing everything that the previous administration did. But at the same time, they see themselves as wanting to take more concessions from the United States and sort of achieve what the previous administration couldn't, as this team sees them, the previous one, being too soft towards the West, the United States and Europe. So reporting and also, from sources, what we're hearing from the 7th round is that even though the hardliners, this new team has agreed to build on the draft or what was, sort of talked about in the first 6 rounds of negotiations, they're trying to make more demands. They're basically expanded what exists from 6 rounds of negotiations. And if you peer to the US and European side, that seems problematic. The UK, Germany, and I believe even France have announced publicly in the United States that Iran's new team's position is problematic. But just looking at the big picture, and I'll try to wrap there, and then I'm happy to answer questions. But I think at this point, both sides seem to be engaged in a sort of blame game of putting so much focus, rather than on diplomacy itself, putting more focus on trying to blame the other for an eventual failure of diplomacy. And I find that problematic because regardless of who wins the blame game, and I give a high chance to the United States for doing that, the failure of diplomacy is going to be a failure for both sides, for all sides. The failure of this talk of an agreement on Iran's nuclear program, putting limits, basically convincing the Iranians to put limits on their nuclear program, is going to lead to what we've seen in the past year or so, an expansion of the program, a more dangerous escalation of Iran's nuclear capabilities. I still don't think Tehran's calculation is to go after a bomb, but they want to push the limit to sort of gain leverage. And then this opens up potentials for military escalation in the region and more instability, military escalation between Iran, the United States, Israel, other US allies, Iran's proxies, any of these. It's a volatile region. You can stumble into conflict. It's not like everything can be planned. The US is not looking for a war with Iran, and a classic all-out war. Iran is not looking for a war with the United States, but both sides and their allies and proxies can stumble into conflict, and conflict can escalate and get out of hand. So in the absence of successful diplomacy, and I'm not saying it has failed yet, but dragging this diplomatic process for too long will bring it closer to failure. So in the absence of successful diplomacy, we can expect more escalation across the region, which will be very dangerous for all parties involved, and eventually civilians pay the price for any kind of military conflict in the region. But I'll stop there, and looking forward to hearing from everyone else and answering questions from the audience.
Okay, but before we go to Trita, I'd just like to ask one question. What leverage, if any, or how much do you think the United States position is handcuffed by what Israel wants? Because Israel obviously has an enormous influence on U.S. domestic policy. We know, at least verbally, the Israelis have been far more aggressive than the United States against Iran, threatening to do everything, including the use of force, to prevent the acquisition of nuclear weapons, which they possess in abundance. Can the United States, you think, domestically afford to walk away from the Israeli position, which seems to forestall any possible agreement?
Well, that's a great point. I think the Israel factor is a very important, it's a key factor in this whole Iran nuclear issue, because at the end of the day, Iran is not a direct threat to US soil, but it is a threat. It can be a threat with its capabilities to US allies in the region, mainly Israel. So it's always been a key factor in all of these negotiations and the pursuit of diplomacy or military escalations. At the same time, I think, well, under the Obama team, we saw that the Israelis were not in the driver's seat when it came to negotiations with Iran, and to the pushback, much public and behind the scenes pushback of Bibi Netanyahu back then. The Obama team eventually did reach an agreement with Iran, which the Israeli prime minister wasn't happy about. I think this team is a little bit different, and Trita is more of an expert on the Iran-Israel dynamic, but I'll just make this note that I think the Biden team is trying to have direct and regular consultation with the Israelis to avoid sort of the public embarrassments that happened under the Obama with Bibi Netanyahu. I also think the new government in Israel is a little bit different, sort of more cautious as far as getting ahead of the United States. And sort of, I don't see that kind of confidence or sort of arrogance that Bibi Netanyahu had when, claiming that he has more votes in US Congress than the US president, kind of situation. I still don't see this new government in that position. So I'll be cautious as far as predicting anything on the Israeli side, but definitely it's a big factor in all of this, the US calculation, US thinking, US strategy. And there's no way for any administration, Republican or Democrat, to just keep them completely out of the equation.
Yeah, I make this one observation, then go to Trita. But you need to remember that the reason why Obama did not seek to have the agreement ratified as a treaty is because he knew he couldn't get 2/3 vote in the Senate. So even though he maybe had the strength to withstand the Israeli lobby, he didn't think he had Congress on his side. But Trita, exactly. Now why don't you make your observations, Trita? We're wonderfully waiting for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for this kind invitation. Great to be with friends on this panel. If I could address that one specific question first, perhaps. I think the Biden administration, as Negar pointed out, had this belief that if they just consulted more closely with the Israelis, they would be able to temper the Israeli opposition, make sure that the Israelis did not create problems in Congress, etc., for them. Obviously, as long as Netanyahu was there, it was quite a mystery as to why that strategy would have any chance. And then when the Bennett government came in, it seemed to have generated a couple of quick victories. Bennett agreed not to play the role that Netanyahu had played in 2015, not create, aggressively go against it, not speak very publicly against the American position. But as we have gotten closer to a phase in the negotiations in which some very crucial decisions need to be made, we have seen that Bennett has started increasingly behave like Netanyahu, not quite, but nevertheless, more so than before, speaking publicly, arguing in favor of zero enrichment, a position the United States has abandoned a long time ago, opposing the very idea of going back to Vienna. Gantz is coming to this town now to make an argument that the United States needs to show that it can take out the Iranian nuclear program militarily, really beef up the military option. And B, we see that the actual red lines of the Israelis had not changed at all. Perhaps they were less quiet than under Netanyahu. But when it comes to actually substantive change, I cannot detect a single one. So that to me raises the question mark of how valuable was all of that investment early on, particularly mindful of the fact that the first couple of weeks of the Biden administration was quite critical. That much of that time was to actually use to consult with Israelis and the Saudis and others rather than go back to Vienna. On the overall picture, it is indeed a very bleak picture. I think one of the problems that exist on the Iranian side is that this new team that is coming in do not have at all the same experience in negotiating with the United States as the previous team. This new team had some encounters with the United States in the negotiations in 2009, which did not lead anywhere. And that raises a very dangerous aspect in my mind, which is these are very sensitive and complex negotiations. I'm not saying they're bad negotiators, I don't know. But I do wonder whether they have the capacity and the skills to be able to calibrate their calculated escalations if it is designed to be a negotiating tactic. Do they know how far to go and how far not to go in those escalations without risking the full collapse of the negotiations? What seemed to have happened in Vienna last week, first of all, I think it was largely expected. No one thought that this is going to be a breakthrough, but they may have gone a bit further than the US or the Europeans expected, and as a result, further dampened the mood there. But then there's also problems elsewhere. First, obviously, the Iranians are walking back in the language of the American side some of the agreements, although everyone has always said nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. Nevertheless, it does create problems. I think there is a major problem on the American side that I'm still not clear as to why it's so difficult to get some movement on. And it's not just about, legally binding guarantees, etc. I think that we have to put that to the side. What the issue, I think, at this point is that it's very clear. If the JCPOA is revived right now, sanctions are lifted, even the ones the Iranians are asking for that Biden is not agreeing to, then at the end of the day, very few, if any, European companies will go back into the Iranian market. Because what they're looking for is not what happens in Vienna. They're looking for what happens in Washington in 2024, who the next president of the United States is going to be. They're not going to go back into Iran and then have to leave again. Because, and this is a profound problem that goes beyond just the negotiations. And the credibility of American promises in negotiations have been dramatically undermined by the political divisions and frankly political instability that exists in the United States. We have now normalized the idea that one administration may not at all respect the decision of a previous administration, as if that has been the standard of American politics. It has not. Remember when Mattis testified in Congress at the hearings to confirm him and was asked about what his position was on the JCPOA. He said that America respects its signature. That was the normal standard line. Now suddenly we're in a position in which is like completely normal that if the United States signs an agreement, whether it's an executive or not, the next administration may not at all care about it and append it as if it's nothing. I think that's a really dangerous situation because not only does it undermine American trustworthiness in general, it really undermines a key leverage the United States has in these negotiations, which is what is the value and the potency of the promises that it's making? And that is a key problem right now. What will happen in 2025 to this deal? The Iranians, are they going to be expected to give up their nuclear leverage for the promise of potentially getting the economic benefit in 2025 if the right president wins? That's not a likely scenario. So we have to address some of these issues because I fear that even if the Russians and the Chinese manage to put some pressure on the Iranians, and it seems like at least the Russians are open to doing so, I'm not so sure that is sufficient to actually be able to break the deadlock that currently exists.
Yeah, I've just make the observation, Trita and the others, one thing that Iran might do is to insist that any agreement to be binding must be ratified by the Senate as a treaty. So it achieves that higher constitutional dignity, which makes it less vulnerable to swings in the White House. It seems kind of odd that, yes, go ahead, Trita.
I mean, you make a great point, and I think anyone who is a supporter of the JCPOA, as I was, would have loved it for it to be a treaty. I think, however, we have to recognize that Trump did tear up a treaty that existed between Iran and the United States, the 1955 Amity Treaty. He just ripped it up. It was a treaty. It was confirmed by the Senate, and it didn't matter. He did it anyway, and there was no opposition to it. I don't think anyone has the confidence. Again, it goes back to the political stability of the United States, that even if it is a treaty, that suddenly makes it much, much costlier and more difficult for the next president to undo it. I don't have any confidence, for instance, that even if it was a treaty, that President Ted Cruz in 2025 wouldn't tear it up anyways.
Well, that might be the case, although if you have it ratified as a treaty, you've developed a political statement that makes it more politically costly for a president to walk away from it. And plus, sure, I say, as a constitutional scholar, you could put in the treaty itself that it can only be revoked by a 2/3 vote of the Senate, and write that into the treaty. And that then would prohibit a president from unilaterally abandoning the treaty. The law there is a little bit messy, but there's nothing that prevents that provision in a treaty. President couldn't walk away without the Senate's consent. Anyway, they're just possible.
Actually, just one last point on that, Bruce. You're absolutely right. But again, it goes back to the fundamental problem. Political polarization and instability in the United States is precisely why there are almost no treaties going forward on almost anything like that, including on this.
Yes, but the Iran, that problem wasn't created by Iran, right?
Certainly not. Yeah, no, it's a wider problem. Yeah, yes. It's a wider problem.
All right, Doug, you're always wonderfully insightful. Give us your views on the JCPOA and where it's going and what its impacts could be.
Well, it's a pleasure to be joining everyone on this issue. It's certainly a very important moment for U.S.-Iranian relations and the issue of the nuclear deal. That are we going to move back to a very ugly past with instability, threats of war, and a lot of other things? The irony with this, it's been noted earlier, is that Iran, of course, does not pose a direct threat to the United States. The notion that Iran would attack the U.S., of course, is fanciful. Given America's extraordinary, military capabilities and what would happen to Iran if it thought, to do so. That what we are dealing with essentially is an indirect threat, primarily being pushed by countries in the region, both Israel and Saudi Arabia, being very important factors in terms of America's policy. I mean, when the JCPOA was negotiated, in many ways, it was a second best even then, but it was still the best second best we could come up with. I mean, the hope was to slow any movement towards nuclear weapons, whether it be actually possession or becoming a nuclear threshold state. There was certainly a hope that it would open up opportunities to address and deal with other regional issues. That and it's important to realize that these are two-way. I mean, folks in the U.S. act as if everything is Iran's fault, without noting America's role in the region, and frankly, a very malign role in many ways. If you look at the invasion of Iraq and involvement in Libya, Syria, et cetera. Nevertheless, a hope that dealing with the nuclear issue could lead to discussions and accommodations on other issues. And also what struck me in many ways as the most important hope was to integrate the people of Iran into the international community, back into an economy and a social order that would show them the opportunities and would help transform Iran on the inside, to understand the options and opportunities that were out there. And unfortunately, all of these were challenged almost immediately. And part of that, of course, was the U.S. sanctions regime that made companies even reluctant then to get involved in Iran. The attack by Republicans, very calculated to suggest that this agreement would not survive. The failure to promote and try to encourage integration of Iran into the international community. And then essentially an assassination or attempted assassination by the Trump administration. That despite support within the administration from Mattis and others, Trump deciding to kill off the treaty and have Pompeo give his famous speech of basically why the Iran should surrender its independent foreign policy to America, and then everything would be wonderful, as if there was the slightest chance that that would ever happen. The hope, of course, was that the Europeans could kind of push it along, and that with Biden supporting it, that we could get into a new administration. And here was the opportunity to restore the JCPOA. The irony is, if it falls, it's going to be on Joe Biden's watch. And in many ways, I think it will be his fault. Part of it, I think, was they seemed to assume that they did have this additional leverage. The Trump folks constantly talked about Biden should use all this great leverage we've given them by putting sanctions on. And what we've seen is the Iranians have proved, no, they have leverage in terms of moving forward on nuclear program as well as activities, in the Gulf. They failed to act decisively to bring the U.S. back in, kind of dawdled, while an Iranian election occurs and hardliners take over the presidency, and frankly failed to have an answer to obvious Iranian objections. As we've talked about, that if you're Iran, who do you think is going to be in power in 2025? That the question of demand for compensation, wanting to keep the gains that they've made while the U.S. had walked out of the treaty. The question of updates. I mean, all of these are issues where the Iranians have very good questions for the U.S. And as far as I can tell, the Biden administration doesn't seem to have any answers. That's the moment they say everybody should get back in and never mind all those other little unpleasantness out there. And so we really do seem to be at a real impasse here. I mean, the U.S. is back to talking in coded terms about military options, which in my view has never been a serious option. It's never a realistic option. The idea of taking the Middle East into another general war, and one that would be far worse than the Iraq War for many reasons, to me should be inconceivable. That it appears that the new Iranian government has decided it probably can live with sanctions, that it's not going to abase itself and give the U.S. whatever it wants to get the JCPOA back in place. And we can very well see ourselves moving back into this very hostile relationship, which has had such a malign influence for decades in the Middle East. I mean, we can go back through 30, 40 years and see what has happened, that one doesn't want to continue that kind of policy. And I worry that we set up, an almost a pure disaster here of imagining Donald Trump making 2024 his campaign program is to destroy the Islamic bomb, to put Iran as the centerpiece of his campaign, which for other reasons may very well succeed. And that's a frightening thought to many of us. So the question of where we go today, it strikes me the Biden administration has to work in concert with an Iranian government that does need to be more flexible. And I think the question of lifting sanctions, as well as ones that were put on by the Trump administration, clearly to sabotage any attempt to get back into the JCPOA. They're labeled other issues, but clearly it was a sabotage attempt. The question of how to promote access to the international economy by Iran at a time where companies are nervous about what happens in the next couple of years. There's no easy answer there. The question of how to deepen ties of Iranian people into the world economy. I mean, these are issues that if the U.S. wants to save the JCPOA, it needs to have some positive answers. And as far as I can tell, we don't have any at the moment. There also needs to be some attempt to deepen the political involvement of at least some Republicans, one hopes, are willing to talk and be somewhat reasonable on an issue like this, as opposed to completely inflexible. Of course, we all know the political partisanship today and where that leads us. Nevertheless, the hope is that there are some folks out there to at least bring into discussions, to show a willingness to address, all parts of the political spectrum, and how to suggest to the Iranians that there are opportunities then in the future for new talks that they also would appreciate. That is, a regional discussion of issues that includes their grievances as well as our grievances. How to perhaps fold that into discussions that we already see ongoing with Saudi Arabia and UAE, which to my mind, are perhaps the most positive events we have going in the Gulf, is to hopefully lessen some of those tensions and move us away from what seems to be a sectarian war, and to make it clear to your residents of the region that this is on them primarily and not the United States. You know, we have a U.S. policy. We have us here 70 years ultimately of almost conflict, going back to the coup d'etat supported, by the U.S., taking us up through today. Much of it being essentially aggression by the U.S. against Iran that has not been helpful. Iran certainly responding badly in a number of places. We need to put that aside and try to find a way to look to the future and not the past. That isn't going to be easy. If we don't do that, I'm very concerned where we're going to end up with a JCPOA that will fully collapse, with us back to the kinds of hostile atmosphere that we've been in the future, and the potential for war. Inadvertent or advertent, it doesn't matter. That would be horrific for all concerned.
Let me ask Doug. You may recall, I think this was in Hillary Clinton's quest for the nomination for the presidency against Obama. She responded that she would annihilate Iran if it attacked or did something adverse to Israel. Never retracted. And aside from that, we have regular instances of Israeli, US-supported assassinations of Iranian scientists, sabotage of Iranians' nuclear program, which, if you look at it parallel, we don't find anything like that happening to us, which if they did to us, we would eliminate them from the face of the earth. With these things ongoing, how much good faith can the Israelis give to anything that we would say?
Well, one can certainly understand the Iranian frustration that from their standpoint, there is an ongoing war against them. And the U.S. is involved, for example, in Syria, primarily, it appears, because we are directing this against Iran. All you have to do is listen to U.S. and Iranian or Israeli rhetoric and look at behavior to see why the Iranians look at this as constant attack. I would like to see the U.S. make very clear that U.S. policy will be set separate from that of its friends in the region, whether it be Israel or Saudi Arabia. That U.S. policy is going to be directed at American interests, and America's interest is having a better relationship with Iran. America's interest is not being sucked into sectarian conflict. American interest is having a good relationship with a civilization that goes back a very long time, people who have a set of interests and the U.S. can appreciate and deal with separate from their grievances and problems with others in the region. I think that's what we need, and it's going to be very hard to get there.
Yeah. Negar, let me ask you, what do you think the consequences would be if Iran announced, okay, we now do have a nuclear capability? Would that lead, in your judgment, to nuclear proliferation in the region? Would that cause Israel to attack? What would be the fallout? It obviously requires some speculation, but what do you think would be the most probable fallout? The failure of diplomacy, and Iran says, well, so what? If Pakistan and Israel and India can have nukes, we can as well.
Bruce, I think it's a great hypothetical question, but I just want to reiterate, I think so far the calculation in Tehran and all indications point to the fact that they're not looking for a nuclear weapons program. As I mentioned, they're trying to push the edge to the limit of what they can do as far as getting the know-how to provide, to produce enough material that can potentially also be used for a weapon. But I think the calculation, and this comes from my interviews and background talks with many Iranian officials in different political camps, their calculation is that the cost of going after an actual weapon is just too high, and it's not something that the United States or Israel or other allies are going to easily tolerate. So I think it's a very interesting or a clear distinction where the way Iran is trying to gain leverage without gaining the actual bomb. Now, any of these calculations may change in the future. There's a fatwa right now by the supreme leader that makes the use of nuclear weapons illegal, unreligious and all of that. But I don't want to predict into the future, but so far, and at least for short term, I can say the calculation is that they're still a member of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're still within the JCPOA. To this day, to those who say Iran doesn't want a deal, my answer is that they are still in the deal. The deal is on life support. It needs to be revived and all of that. It's almost dead, but they're still in the deal. So it's not something they want to pursue. As far as a hypothetical situation, I also think Tehran is right to assume that there's a high cost, that the United States and especially Israel are not going to easily tolerate Iran's race for an actual bomb. How they're going to deal with that depends on who's in power here in Washington, who is in power in Israel. But I think the important point I want to make is that that's just not something Tehran is pursuing at the moment.
Yeah. Trita, what do you think? Suppose, however, they stop short of a bomb, but they do move towards a capability because diplomacy shipwrecks. Are other countries in the region like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, are they prepared to at least to develop a capability and say, well, we need at least the same standing as Iran does on having something at least close to an operational weapon?
Certainly, there is a risk for it. I do wonder if that risk has been a bit exaggerated. Would we worry about the Saudis doing it mindful of the leverage that the United States actually has over Saudi Arabia if it wants to? I'm, obviously admitting that the United States rarely uses its leverage against Saudi Arabia. We see that in Yemen quite clearly today. But if we are serious about non-proliferation, if we are serious about that risk and don't want to see it happen, I have no doubt in my mind that the United States could do quite a lot to make sure that it doesn't happen. I think some of those concerns are justified, but in my view, they're all the more a reason as to why we need to restore the JCPOA. In fact, if we have the JCPOA and the other countries say we want to have the JCPOA as well, I would be 100% in favor of that. Absolutely. Open up with the same degree of inspections that the Iranians have agreed to, the same type of limitations, etc. I think that would be a much safer world than what we have right now, particularly if there is, and in many cases, an open speculation by the Saudis and others that they would develop the capability.
Doug, let me ask you if this is, you may recall that when I think the SALT II treaty couldn't get ratified, the Congress passed a resolution saying no money could be spent that violated, the SALT II provisions. Is that a possibility? If Biden can't pass or get anything through, or even a Trump, could a Democratic Congress, you think, get a provision that would at least through the appropriations power force compliance with the JPCOA?
Well, I suppose that they could bar the use of any public funds to impose, add, or enforce sanctions. I think it's primarily a negative power. It's hard for me to, if they could try to force, money will be used to eliminate all sanctions. I'm not sure how that, the courts do tend to take separation of powers, fairly seriously, and whether they would allow Congress to mandate that, I'm not certain. That would be rough. I mean, of course, if you had a majority in the, in both Congress, in both House and Senate, presumably you could pass an agreement, if not a treaty, that you could still might be able to pass some kind of a presidential agreement, even if not a treaty, which would be better. I mean, obviously because of the 2/3. Certainly with a majority, you have a lot more options. The problem now, the presumption, I mean, if you look at the Senate vote on cutting off arms for Saudi Arabia and Yemen, I mean, it was basically a 2/3 vote to uphold the Saudis. So that tells you that you had 1/3 in the Senate. I mean, that's just not much to work for if you're trying to cobble together some kind of legislative support for the JCPOA.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think that Congress is kind of phased out. It gets to return to a kibitzing role in foreign policy. It really takes no lead. I can't imagine a Henry Cabot Lodge, leading a campaign against a Versailles Treaty. It just wouldn't possibly happen here. Let me ask Trita, is there anything in the future of Iranian politics that you think could lead to a more open or receptive or skillful diplomacy? Or are we going back toward the more aggressive approach of Ahmadinejad?
I think everyone is still hoping that what we saw in Vienna was an opening bid, and as a result, the Iranians are going to show it a bit more flexibility in the next rounds, which again will not be sufficient because it will have to be met with American flexibility as well, as was the case last time around. So I think it's too early to tell if what they're doing now is their new standard and that it's essentially a negotiating team that only has one gear. Mindful of the importance of the JCPOA, I have a hard time seeing that there wouldn't be adjustment. I would see it as a rather typical thing that they would do something like this. In fact, what they did in Vienna was to go very aggressive on the nuclear front, meaning of the things that they would have to scale back. But what they suggested on the sanctions front in that working group was pretty much what they had said earlier on. So there wasn't a significant amount of change there. And the question then is, are they doing this in order to make sure that there's greater flexibility on the American side in the sanctions front, and then they will have to scale back some of the things that they've said in the nuclear working group? We don't know yet. The next round is going to start on Thursday. At least the Europeans are ready to stay there for 9 days. And the hard end, dead end is because of Christmas. And try to make sure that there's enough coming out of that agreement or that round that will justify continuing the talks with some degree of hope and optimism. There is an alternative outcome of all of this that I have to want to be very clear. I am not advocating for it. I'm just saying that I think, unlike 2015, where I think it was quite clear that if there wasn't a deal, there would be a move towards war. I am not so sure that this time around it is as straight. It can definitely still happen, probably still the most likely scenario, but I think there may be another scenario this time around because of changing circumstances. And that is what I would call like the coma option, which the JCPOA essentially is dead, but all sides pretend that it's still alive. And the West has shown itself to be very capable of pretending that the Oslo peace process has been alive for the last 30 years, when it clearly has not. And the reason for this is because right now it seems that both sides feel that the political cost for them to actually agree to a compromise is too high. So they're not willing to do it, at least not yet. At the same time, the cost of war is absolutely disastrous. But if they keep some form of a format alive, a status quo, in which the United States does not lift the sanctions, it may actually increase some of the sanctions, although they probably will not be terribly effective. The Iranians continue to expand the program, but far less aggressively than they have so far, because if they're not using it for negotiation leverage, they probably won't be needing that type of an escalation. The Europeans, I think, would be happy with it, because otherwise, the minute you admit that the JCPOA is dead, then you have a massive crisis on your hands, and they cannot afford that right now if they could choose it away. And the big uncertainty, of course, is what the Israelis would do. But there too, I think there's small signs of potential change, because I think the Israelis have come to the conclusion that it is perhaps not at all as likely as it was before that the United States will take military action, not just on its own, but also even if Israel were to initiate action, that the Americans would then automatically feel obliged to follow suit. This means that if the Israelis continue to make threats of this kind and then the US doesn't do it, and then Israel also doesn't do it, then Israel will have lost a lot of credibility. And so as long as the Iranians don't escalate too much, the United States doesn't lift the sanctions so that the Iranian economy is still under these crippling pressures, and they continue to do their sabotage, but probably with far less spectacular things, so that they allow the Iranians the ability to deny that anything happened at all, then I can see that perhaps for a period of time, there will be some sort of a coma status, not terribly stable, but far more stable than it would have been a couple of years ago. And the only positive that can come out of that is that at least perhaps they will keep the option of going back to the table alive when all sides are much more serious than they are right now.
Yeah. Negar, let me ask you two questions. One, to what extent is there indigenous support within Iran to renounce a nuclear capability or a nuclear bomb? Is there really anyone, any party, even dissidents, Nobel Prize winners who argue Iran just should announce we will not have a bomb? And then the second is, what, if any, support is there in Israel for rejecting the idea that Iran is an existential threat and that the Netanyahus have vastly magnified, its danger to Israel in order to obtain a political benefit?
Well, Bruce, as far as Iranian public opinion, first I want to speak with a caveat that polling in Iran, political polling of this nature, especially about national security issues, very important issues like the nuclear program, Iran's regional policy, it's very sensitive and it's not done with much independence. Definitely can't be done by the opposition. So it all comes with a caveat. But we have seen, interestingly, we have seen fairly strong support for a civilian nuclear program or the civilian nuclear program. Now, the extent of it varies. How much to enrich? Do you get close to the enrichment level that can be used for something beyond a civilian program? But I would say, because Iran's nuclear program is, the civilian program is used for various research and scientific medical purposes, there's this conversation that it potentially may be able to replace a portion of the fossil fuel as energy industry and all of that. But there's also very vocal opposition to the cost, to the political cost, which also comes in the form of economic cost, meaning sanctions, crippling economic sanctions are imposed on Iran as a result of the expansion of the nuclear program or the nuclear program altogether. So there's very vocal opposition to it, especially outside the country among the exiles and certain opposition parties, critics inside Iran. It's just hard to gauge that at every moment. I wouldn't say any side really is the majority as it goes ups and down. But if you talk about an actual nuclear bomb, I hear very little talks and discussions of that. Even the hardliners, when they're in power, or the ones that are very close to the officials in power, are very careful. They're realizing that any comment can be picked up by an American newspaper, an Israeli newspaper at any moment. And I feel like the ones that are closer to power among the hardliners are also very careful as far as openly discussing an actual nuclear weapons program. That I have seen conversations of that kind, basically as a continuation of the escalation, saying, as you initially asked, why doesn't Iran just go down the same path as Pakistan or North Korea, just get it done and then join the club and then you'll be invincible. But it's not a very widespread, I would say, dialogue even among the hardliners. And then I just wanted to make one other point about, we're talking hypotheticals. President Biden, at any moment still, or from the beginning of his administration in January, could and still can issue an executive order. It's within the power of the president, without lifting sanctions. Yeah, he can issue an executive order and just announce symbolically that the United States is now returning back to the JCPOA. What would that achieve? One, the US can rejoin the actual table because, as many of you know, Iran and the US are not negotiating directly. They're across the street in two different hotels, and the Europeans are walking back and forth in the winter of Vienna conveying messages of what went on in the room. And the reason for that is the US is not part of the JCPOA, is not part of that framework, the P5+1, the table of where everyone is sitting at. So it's Iran and the other parties, and then the US negotiators in a different hotel. So an executive order, which is within the power of the president, would first resolve that issue. When negotiators, Iranian-Americans, sit face to face, so much more can be achieved than if you're at different hotels across the street. And it would also give some confidence to the Iranians. It would sort of put the US and Iran on equal footing. Both of you are now in the deal, in a deal which you signed, but not in full compliance. So the US will be back in a deal, but at reduced compliance or a lack of compliance, which is sort of the situation Iran is at now, reduced compliance. And then they can easily negotiate a sequence of return to full compliance. But right now, when the US talks about returning to mutual compliance, they're essentially outside of the deal that Iran is still inside. And you also had a question about Israeli public opinion. Maybe Trita should take that.
Yeah, well, Trita or Doug, either one. There have been Israeli generals, they're tired, that say that Iran is not an existential threat, that Netanyahu and his disciples magnify the threat manyfold in order to justify Israel having their nuclear program unpoliced, and to be very, very aggressive and insistent that the United States be equally antagonistic toward Iran. Is that something that can grow in Israel? The ouster of Netanyahu foreshadow anything like that, or is that just a maverick out there that voice is going to die?
Let me make a quick comment and then I'll hand it off to Trita. I just want to point out, in support of diplomacy, that the Israeli intelligence apparatus concluded that the nuclear deal is actually to the benefit of Israel because it puts a strong enough cap on Iran's nuclear program. So they were in support of the JCPOA as opposed to Bibi Netanyahu, who was very much opposed to it politically. From a security and intelligence viewpoint, that part of the Israeli structure was supporting the JCPOA. But Trita knows more about all of this.
Trita, let's have Doug come in first. I think he's entitled to time, and then we'll shift right to you.
I think the problem in Israel is that the political system itself has shifted very hard to the right. I mean, there are a number of former Mossad and other officials who have made the case that, in fact, Iran is not an existential threat, that as much as one might dislike it as a state and a government, that it has not shown itself to be suicidal, and that there's no reason to believe that it would engage in an act that would ensure that everyone in Tehran would leave this earth in a radioactive funeral pyre. That's very unlikely. The problem is that Netanyahu was thrown out by essentially an equally right-wing coalition, or a coalition that ranged from hard right to some moderates. So the challenge there, I think, is that it's very hard politically to change the calculus on an issue like this, even though there's very strong national security support for a much more measured view. But again, I think Trita might have some observations here that would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, look. The idea that Israel views Iran as an existential threat is part of the Israeli government line. But is Israel's actual conduct such that that belief is translated into policy? It never has been. In fact, you have three heads of the Mossad in a row: Ephraim Halevi, Bandow, and also I forgot the guy in the middle, his name, have been on the record saying that Iran is not an existential threat. Iran is a threat, a challenge, a problem. Existential, no. Ehud Barak has been saying that since 1992. And they've had their various reasons for doing so. The first and foremost one is that it's not true, but also because they thought that it was actually a problematic statement because it belittles Israel's own power, which is immense, to say that Iran is an existential threat. But in Washington, that line has been repeated over and over again because it's been aimed at pushing the United States in a specific direction. If you accept all of the different specific elements that the Israelis have been putting into the Washington debate, A, Iran is an existential threat. B, they are irrational. C, they are messianic and suicidal. Well, if they're messianic, suicidal, irrational, and an existential threat, all of those three combined ensures that you cannot have diplomacy, you cannot have deterrence because you cannot have a deterrence against an irrational suicidal actor. The only option you're left with is to take preemptive military or preventive military strikes, which has been the aim of the Israelis. So this is much more of a way of constructing the situation to push the United States in a specific direction than an actual belief that the Israelis have held and have acted.
Negar, let me ask you, how much, if any, is what happened in Libya after Gaddafi abandoned WMD an influence on Iran, whether it's explicit or implicit? We've got to have some kind of WMD leverage, or otherwise they're going to go back to another Mossadegh effort to overthrow the government, and we're not going to accept that.
Well, the fear of regime change or pushes for regime change in Iran are very serious, and I think for good reasons. You know, just this previous U.S. administration was explicitly sort of, you know, not exactly using the words, but Secretary Pompeo clearly was pushing towards that. U.S. allies, powerful allies in the region, Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, Israel, have all one way or another over the years sort of pointed to that. So the fear for wanting the Islamic Republic to be overthrown inside the Islamic Republic is very serious. But again, going back to my previous point, I think right now also there's this sort of parallel pushback towards that fear that a nuclear weapon, the high political and then now the economic cost of going for an actual weapon is not worth it. It is not the only solution. But at the same time, Iran has a domestic non-nuclear weapons program, missiles that they've developed domestically, and proxies and allies across the region. All of these, Iran's entire regional policy is shaped with this notion that there's very serious attempts or intentions of an overthrowing of the Islamic Republic since the beginning. The revolution, the invasion, not invasion, but the attack by Saddam, the Iran-Iraq war, the years of Iraq war are very, fresh and alive in the psyche of the Iranian, both political class and also the Iranian population. That was seen as an attempt to sort of either overthrow or weaken or take over the country. So it's a serious fear, and I think that's why Iran has developed sort of this defensive, or in some areas of the region, offensive posture, the regional policy they have, and it's something that's not necessarily non-negotiable, but it's very difficult for them to negotiate when, for example, you hear from certain policy circles in the US, why don't they just give up their missiles? They see that as a defense because there is this notion of an attempt for regime change in the country. So I think, again, my understanding still is that the calculation is not a nuclear bomb, but a combination of all of these other policies and capabilities, and also allyship support of a country like Russia, China, be it at the Security Council, in the UN, or on the ground, the partnership in Syria and all of that are part of that big picture thinking that there is an intention by US and its allies to sort of overthrow the government in Tehran, and I honestly think they have good reasons to think like that.
Yeah, Doug, you remember in 1956, Eisenhower repudiated the attack on Suez involving Israel, France, Great Britain, and Eisenhower was able to, he won re-election. Today, is there any possibility you see the politics in the United States restoring to that kind of mood and ability to act even-handedly in the Middle East? Or we're so captured by Israel and the oil interests that we're basically frozen or paralyzed, and we can't be a neutral anymore?
Well, it's certainly gotten a lot worse. I mean, George H.W. Bush was relatively even-handed, and the Secretary Baker. I mean, that there clearly was an understanding in that administration. Even Ronald Reagan was horrified by the invasion of Lebanon and put some pressure on Israel, and after, the Shatila, the Palestinian camps, et cetera. So we've had that impulse. I think the particular problem is it's in the congressional Republican Party. It's not just a question of an administration. I mean, Donald Trump at one point when he was running for office talked about even-handed treatment of Palestinian and Israelis, and that was kind of the last we heard of it. And we certainly didn't see it when he was president. But so much of this pressure comes from the congressional side. So it's going to be very hard for any Republican. Now, we are seeing, I think, a change on the Democratic side, that younger progressives are very upset and concerned. They care about human rights. They recognize that there's blowback, which is something you would think Republicans could understand, that if you occupy other people for 50, 60 years, bad things will happen. That this is not a policy to promote stability. It's not a what Israel needs is peace. I mean, you tell people, Israel needs peace, and Israel needs, to live with Palestinians and Arabs. It needs to live with those in the region. That would seem to be an obvious, but I think here the real issue, especially on the Republican right, gets into religious eschatology, which contaminates a certain amount of this, that you can talk logically about the politics, but the moment you get into some of that, and then I think that makes it much tougher. And you see some of the the interest groups, the NGOs, it's going to be very hard. We need somebody like a George H.W. Bush with very strong internationalist credentials to point out his experience, his or her experience, and to make the point that we have to be able to live with people on both sides. That what we need to be is both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. This is not an issue of being anti-Israeli. It's an issue of being pro both peoples and finding a way to help them live together in peace.
Yeah, I think we're about the end of the time here. I wanted to ask Trita a last question. I think it's been at least reported that our intelligence community at one time concluded in about 2003, Iran had abandoned its nuclear program, and then it reinstituted it. I don't know, what year that was. But could you explain what would be the dynamics that have caused the program at least to be put on hold or frozen, and what provoked Iran to move on that plateau again?
So it wasn't the nuclear program that had been abandoned. It was that the Iranians had elements of embryonic weapons program up until 2003, and that was abandoned. And it's not been reinstituted ever since. And we just had the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, who have a tremendous amount of experience with Iran in particular, and the JCPOA, saying that he's seen no evidence that the Iranians are going up to 90% or doing anything else that would go in the military territory. Part of the reason why they abandoned it in 2003 is most likely because Saddam Hussein was taken out. I mean, there's been so much focus of thinking that the Iranians are building a nuclear weapons program because they want to focus on Israel, or that Saddam was doing it because he wanted to focus on the United States. Actually, we know from the interviews with Saddam Hussein after he was captured that part of the reason why he didn't fully come clear about the fact that he actually given up most of it, if not all of it, was because he didn't want the Iranians to think that he didn't have it, because his obsession was Iran. Similarly, the Iranians were very focused on what Saddam was doing and not doing. And it seems like the key motivation for them to have a program was precisely Saddam and the fear of a second war with Iraq. In 1988, when the war ended, both sides felt that the truce was unstable and that there would be another war, and that the other side could not handle the amount of casualties in that other war. So as a result, both sides felt that the other side would use weapons of mass destruction in the first phase of the next war. That was a key motivating factor for the Iranians and the Iraqis to go in that direction. With Saddam out of the picture, it appears that that may have been the key reason as to why the Iranians abandoned those elements back in 2003.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're out of time here. Does anyone want to make any final comments? I think there's a consensus. Everybody agrees that diplomacy ought to be pursued with both competence and versatility, that the option of diplomacy is going to be grim, even if we don't know the details. And there's going to be require some kind of evolution in our political culture, certainly on the US side, I think, to make that happen.
Bruce, if you allow me, I would like to thank you for moderating this wonderful event. I'd like to thank my friend Trita Parsi, Doug Bandow, dear friend, and Negar for participating in this insightful event. We hope to have you again with us. And if there are any questions, I think we still can do 3, 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
I saw one question, Bruce, if there's time, if you allow me, I'm happy to take that question.
Sure.
From, I believe, Harold Walker, the question is that, do you take encouragement from the fact that improving the economy was high on the aim of the stated aims of the new Iranian regime, which would be very difficult to achieve without the lifting of US sanctions? I agree that economic improvement will be high to achieve without the lifting of sanctions. Also, Iran has a large amount of assets frozen outside the country, billions of dollars, at the request of the US as an enforcement of US sanctions. But with this hardline team, I want to put it this way, they want sanctions relief, and they actually call these nuclear negotiations to lift sanctions, or to get rid of these tyrannical sanctions, as they call them. But they don't feel like they need them. They want it, they don't need it. So there's only so much concession, I think, this team specifically, and the Iranian state as a whole is going to make, and just wanting sanctions relief and be willing to give up anything for that kind of relief is just not something that I see. Of course, they came in the first round of negotiations, they came in with maximalist demands, which I think is the natural thing you do when you're negotiating, and then you're willing to sort of pull back your position and make concessions as negotiations continue. But I just think this goes back to why those like myself think that the Trump policy of maximum pressure was a failure, because it was the ultimate pressure by US sanctions, and it didn't achieve any policy goals. It basically didn't achieve any change in policy in Iran, even though it inflicted a lot of economic pressure.
Let me ask you this, Negar, and also Doug, if you know, how effective are the sanctions? How leaky are they? Are there benefits that persons get because it's very profitable, to evade the sanctions? You get high super markups on whatever you're selling, and I would think, especially the Chinese, if not the Russians, would be eager to try to circumvent the sanctions. But how strictly enforceable are they as a practical matter?
Well, they do have a real impact. On the other hand, sanctions evasion is an entire industry. I mean, we see that with, say, North Korea, where Chinese enforcement goes up and down depending upon their political calculation, how irritated they are with the North and how irritated they are with the United States, as well as profit. I mean, North Korea has managed to move ahead with nuclear weapons and create them despite sanctions. Iran has been able to sell oil to a number of countries where those countries in many ways are too important for the US to fully sanction. So the US has threatened China that, well, at some point we might really enforce this stuff. We don't want you buying their oil. The US wasn't happy when China announced its major deal, and we'll see what comes from that deal and how much money actually flows. Nevertheless, that shows that countries can play a game of chicken. And then a lot of the stuff occurs off the books. I mean, you constantly change your companies, you recharter companies, you recharter ships. We had the issue of the Iranian oil vessels going to Venezuela, and the question of who owns them and what's on them and where are they headed. Companies turn off transponders. We have a lot of that with the North Koreans, kind of ghost ships that suddenly seem to disappear, and then suddenly reappear somewhere else. And we can presume, well, they've probably been offloading coal or oil or something. So the sanctions do have an impact, and they make it much harder for normal employment, normal commercial relations, which frankly would be the best that we could have with Iran, of integrating it into the world economy. Nevertheless, the Iranians certainly know how to make some money off of it and get around them, and they spend a lot of money doing so, and a lot of people make a lot of money doing so.
Yeah, I remember a conversation that Trump had with President Erdogan of Turkey about Halkbank and evading sanctions against Iran. And it was just a political deal as far as Trump was concerned. It had nothing to do with the sanctions regime. But Negar,
Let me add.
Yeah.
I just want to add a quick point to your point and Doug's point. I just want to clarify that there's a small class of elite in the country. They're called Kasaban Tahrim or sanctions profiteers in Iran who actually do benefit, as Doug was explaining, from sort of this shady market, which lacks any transparency. The state has to rely on non-state actors to sell large sums of oil, move massive amounts of money. I've heard of sanctions profiteers opening bank accounts across the world for their infant, in the name of their infant child, putting millions of dollars, moving millions of dollars. But what that does to the country is that it creates an ecosystem for corruption, benefiting the most corrupt class. And at this point, these are not just government officials. These are, civilians who are benefiting, who are coming in to sort of help the state. It becomes a policy of the state because they want to circumvent the sanctions. They want to, continue selling. But it just adds so much. And there is a lot of corruption in Iran, to the level of corruption, while the real civilians, the everyday person, suffers the economic pressure and the impact of sanctions.
Yeah. I just make a general observation. I think it's probably time to close it. That is, I think that the ability to make the sanctions pinch is going to be much attenuated once Bitcoins come into play, and it's going to be much more difficult to police the money laundering or whatever. I think that's probably the nightmare of the sanctions community, certainly OFAC and CIA, but it's clearly coming. And anyway, it's another element that shows that we're dealing not with a static.
You're right, it has already arrived. The Bitcoin sanctions circumvention has already started. It's going on,
Did you want to have any final words to say before we sign off, Khalid?
No, thank you again. And we hope to see you in another panel in the future. And that's it.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.